Hello, I'm Jeff Klein. Pull up my presentation here. Okay, well, I'll get started. So Nancy, let me know if anything's not showing up or can't hear me, but
it looks great.
Okay, great. I work for the Idaho Department of Lands. I'm a remote sensing analyst and involved heavily in our work to get more LiDAR incorporated into our different agency practices. We have a lot of Idaho state endowment land throughout basically the entire state of Idaho. And it's a mixture of different land use practices with grazing and oil and gas. And we do work with navigable waters and forestry, but on the LiDAR side, it really has been all forestry so far. So that's kind of my focus today, is how we've tried to use LiDAR to enhance our forestry program. It basically is the big money-making program for the endowments to do forestry practices on endowment ground. And that's kind of where the money's come from, and that's where we focused a lot of our efforts. So we've done a little bit of feature extraction and stuff for other departments, but it's really looking at the trees and timber asset endowment land. So I think probably a little maybe over 5 years is when the IDLs really started to take LiDAR serious. One of the big first IDL specific LiDAR acquisitions was in an area up in northern Idaho in a watershed that's called the Middle Fork of the East River up in the Selkirk. And hired QSI to do a quality 1 flight on this watershed. It's almost all endowment ground, state land, and basically had them do a complete soup to nuts, every product they could give to the department, and start looking at, okay, what is the real practical use for forestry for LiDAR for this state, where we actually can come up with return on investment for this sort of technology and so forth. So they did all kinds of stream delineation, road delineation, all of your raster products, and also looked more in depth at some tree information and segmenting out each individual tree and getting more of a forest inventory sort of package as well, which gets a little more experimental, and we'll get more into that. But I came in after this flight. I joined the IDL after this data was acquired and have worked with it a bit, but it's a really good kind of initial test site for us because it highlights in this terrain a lot of the benefits of LiDAR for forestry. It's extremely steep and rugged terrain with complex stream networks, lots of landslide issues, and a lot of historical logging practices and so forth, where there's a variety of abandoned roads and things you can't pick up as easily when you're out there. So if you look kind of up in the higher elevations of this, you can see where some of the landslides have formed, and that was one of our big interests, is through our logging practices, if we remove trees and remove that root cohesion, how we may cause future landslides and how we can identify landslide prone terrain. And other than that, come up with these extremely complex road networks, which is one of the easiest benefits of LiDAR for us, is that you can pick up old abandoned roads. That was kind of what we were talking about with the X-ray goggle idea, but you can be standing out in some of these areas and the timber's so thick you can't even tell there was ever an abandoned road there. But if you can throw a hillshade or a DEM on a tablet and take it out there, you can look at some of these delineated road networks that we've done and say, well, sure enough, there was a road here at some point. And it really has kind of been a game changer for our natural resource professionals to be able to change future harvests and work they're doing out there by utilizing stuff they would have never seen. But yeah, and then this, looking at the stream network here, this is an accumulation raster, but this is a really interesting area if anybody's ever been there. It's on the backside of Schweitzer in northern Idaho. It's good backcountry skiing, but it's kind of extremely deep, dense creek beds where you can really get caught in some interesting areas where there's really just a lot of water running through there and so forth. And topography is really gnarly. So that's kind of a look at, you can look at how in depth some of these stream networks are, which is another pretty standard use of LiDAR that we've looked at pretty seriously. Is instead of taking NHD, how can we really look at what sort of stream networks are out there by delineating streams using the LiDAR DEMs. And it's a big deal for our forestry practices because it changes the ways in which we would harvest an area, leaving streams to shade areas, especially if it's what we call a class 1 stream, meaning it's fish bearing. It's taken very seriously in the FPA rules to not over harvest areas where you want to leave shade to make consistent temperatures and so forth for native fish habitat. So that's kind of where we started off. I've been doing this for a few years now, and one of the interesting things, I used to just do GIS development work, and now that I'm focused a lot on LiDAR, the LiDAR is an interesting technology for an agency like this because right off the bat, just your standard topographic DEM data and hillshades and so forth are enough return of investment on LiDAR acquisitions that it actually makes my job a lot easier, because as much as some of the stuff I'll get into where we're trying to increase the return investment on LiDAR and pick up more information out of it, at the end of the day, just getting this high definition topographic data into the hands of our guys out in the field is enough benefit. They get enough out of this information that it's really all anybody would need if we weren't going to kind of push it a step further. But this is an area called Benton Butte that's near Dorshack Reservoir, more in central Idaho, another rugged terrain, and it's a really hard area to access with very few roads, so it's got really massive timber, and it was an interest site for the IDL to fly LiDAR. But just looking at the DEM and showing kind of some of our terrain here. And then basically our next objectives for the agency is to really get a lot more from our timber inventory information out of the LiDAR point clouds. So here's one of our plots that we've done where we've segmented out all of the trees. We're probably pretty on par with a lot of industrial timber companies or state agencies going down the same path here, where we've found a lot of uses for LiDAR just from road layout and the topographic information. And then now we're really pushing, okay, well, we happen to have this really in-depth 3D model of our forests. We really need to know what trees are out there and how much volume, and look at some growth and yield predictions and so forth. So how do we use this same model and trying to bridge that gap from traditional stand-based inventory approaches to also incorporating the information pulled in from the LiDAR? So that's kind of our next big step, or our big focus here that we've been working on the last couple of years. So we've done some work where we've segmented out all of our individual our tree approximate objects, and assigned as much attribute information as we can to those. So looking at those trees from the previous slide, we statistically try to predict a lot of information about each tree we pull. So there's a lot of things we look at, but the easy ones out of the LiDAR is the height. The tree heights for canopy dominant trees that you get from LiDAR is a really, really accurate, helpful benefit from the canopy height models, being able to know exactly how tall those trees are. And then from there, everything gets a little trickier. Species is a really big one for us, and it really changes the way in which our area offices will look at doing different forestry practices. So if we can identify pockets of different species, it's really important, but it's also a really hard thing to figure out, and it's the nut that everybody really wants to crack. So some of the stuff we've looked at is we fly multispectral imagery alongside with the LiDAR sensor in some of these contracts to basically build a stack of raster information where we can hopefully pull more into these tree approximate objects to statistically derive species out of it. So with the ability to also get the NDVI readings for these little tree areas, and as well as the intensity information from the LiDAR and so forth, and the slope, elevation, aspect, and region and all that sort of stuff, we can increase the reliability of a species prediction in these LiDAR-derived tree data sets. And that ends up being a pretty important factor, because the next things we start looking at is our overall volume with these individual trees, and that's derived from combinations of DBH and height, and a lot of the original DBH that you're getting is coming from the species you sign. So it's kind of this crux in the puzzle to get all this other information, is how reliably can we pull any species out. So here's kind of a look at if we symbolize one of this tree approximate object data sets by species, and kind of what it would look at. And you know, the common problems here with this stuff is picking up understory trees. When you start looking through your point cloud, you can really see those dominant trees on top. As you start zooming in inside of the canopy, the understory trees, you just start to see kind of a mass of vegetation. But actually being able to identify what's a tree or what's 5 trees, it really makes it difficult to keep your statistical results accurate, because there's so many ways to get off track really quick, that it really kind of is a head scratcher how to keep these individual trees segmented in a way that you can believe accurately represents what's going on in the forest. So here's a 3D look at some of these tree approximate objects here. So you can see, I think green be Doug fir, and I'm guessing red subalpine fir, and then you can see the grand fir, smaller blue ones mixed in there too, or as most. Yellow would be larch, and so forth. So just kind of a look at it. Another issue we found just with segmenting out all of these trees is another classic problem with LiDAR is it's so much data. What do you do with it? Because it's just really hard to even zoom around these data sets. They'll make your computer crash pretty quick. So even if you can get it really accurate, it's like, well, yeah, there's a lot of trees out there, but how do I even look at that? Making these kind of models takes some time. And yeah, it's just another one of those classic things with LiDAR where you're working with so much data, but we're still using some old Idaho state computers, and trying to get everybody to use this data is kind of a bit of an issue in itself. But this is basically the original approach we took, was looking at these individual trees, segmenting out, and using that to build our tree information from the LiDAR. And the approach we've kind of stepped back towards now is more of a classic approach that is commonly used, which is a pixel-based approach, or the raster approach, as you hear it called, where within certain cell size, often 10 meter squared cells, you just assign attributes in a raster grid to each cell. So you can take a cell, and within a cell, you're going to have a bunch of trees, but you can statistically derive, hey, with all these trees, we know this is a basal area of 160 or whatever it is, or this is our quadratic mean diameter, or this is our average tree height, and so forth. And you start stacking these different pieces of information into these cells and getting information that way. The hard part about this is, as much as it's the statistics are simpler, because we can really kind of correlate some of our field data to these different cells in a way that's a lot more tangible. We can say, well, we know that when we're out in the woods, we have this much volume in this same area. And it becomes very clear when you're looking at the LiDAR point cloud, and you can see basically a mass of biomass. You can say, yeah, clearly there's some real connections here to these field plots, and what the LiDAR is telling us is there. So we're happy with the confidence we get out of this sort of statistical products. The problem is implementing it into our system. because our standard practice with cruising would be to actually get a list of trees. And that is what we use to grow and do growth and yield modeling and say what's it going to look like here in 100 years as these trees grow and so forth. And to go to this raster-based approach where we don't actually have a list of trees, we're not even actually looking at each tree. How do you come up with these same sort of results in the long run is kind of a pretty standard issue a lot of people are dealing with in this forestry world. So one thing we've done is say, okay, well, we've got this raster-based approach where we make these rasters and we look at the canopy height models and we know how much volume is in these cells, and we can apply that to our stands and start looking at how much volume is there. Even though we can't use our standard growth and yield modeling patterns, the next thing we're looking at is how to actually grow these rasters out as well. So this is a picture of a stand where we've done 100 years, what's the growth rate going to look like? And so I didn't put the symbology on here, but basically blue would be growing a lot faster, red is not growing very much. So this is kind of a new phase we're going into, but we're pretty excited where this sort of work's headed, because it just on the surface is starting to look pretty accurate. You can tell here underneath in the white, you've got a canopy height model, and you can tell that in the middle of this is some real white. This is a stand that has not been harvested, and these are some big trees. And on the outsides there is some areas where it was recently harvested, and you can tell that this sort of modeling is picking up that along the edges of this mature stand, the trees are growing a lot faster because they're picking up more sunlight and so forth along here and anywhere they're near roads. And in these real thick dominant stands where it's deep inside the stand, there's almost no growth at all over a 100-year period. So doing this sort of modeling, as we hone it in a little bit, the goal is to add information to our stand data set saying, this is how much volume we predict in 100 years. This is the amount of years before you should do some sort of harvest of some sort and things like that, which is where this information really starts to get powerful for the guys who are out there making these decisions. And what else was I going to say about that? I don't remember. Maybe it'll come to me. But yeah, it's interesting stuff. So with this raster-based approach, we basically can apply all this information to our existing stand data set. So we have these stands that are these polygons of topographically alike areas and so forth, where we can say within this area we have this much volume. But one of the powers of doing this raster-based approach, where we have this stack of rasters that tells us all this tree information, is we can also bring that down to a smaller scale and give our area foresters the ability to just look at particular areas of interest, because the data is all stored in these pretty fine rasters. So there's a lot of information down to smaller scales. So here's a tool we built last year where within an ArcGIS desktop environment, a forester can go around, take an area where maybe they have some logging activity coming up and they want to say, oh, well, what's it doing over here on this north face where we could extend this project or so forth. We've given them the ability to just come in, draw an area of interest anywhere they want in their sites, and then we'll run a tool, which is running now, which will say, here's what the LiDAR says is in this area. So we've expanded this to even more information now, but in this example, you've got the acreage, how much volume, how many trees per acre, basal area, what's the max slope, and what's the average slope, which would depend on the type of logging they might do or whatever work they have or any concerns about landslides and so forth. So they can basically come in here and have full control to look at different areas, and they're not stuck with some overall survey package or something. So this is with this approach, this is one of the tools we're pretty excited about, really giving them a lot of power to look at some of this tree information. There's one more here. Yeah, so that's a 4-acre spot, pretty steep, max slope of 57%, and not a lot of trees in there, as you can kind of see in the imagery. That says 25, I don't know, my screen's sorry. Yeah, so kind of coming full circle here when I'm talking about this pixel or raster-based approach to get information about the trees on state endowment land. In order to do that, basically the concept is you send somebody out and you do a bunch of LiDAR calibration field plots. So they go out and they take a circle and they measure every single tree in that circle. And you get a full stem map list of all these trees that are in this spot and exactly where their azimuth and distance to the center of that plot is, so that you can stick them on a GIS and see each tree that was measured out in the field and compare it to the trees within the LiDAR data set. And so this is kind of some of the work we've done, is setting up these calibration plots and stratifying where we want to go out and get these plots to get an overall survey sample. And that's what we use to do our statistical correlations, where we come up with this information, where we're comparing what we know is in the field to what the LiDAR shows, and start to look for patterns in the LiDAR that match what we see in the field. And basically what it comes down to is combinations of the height of the trees and the average height of the trees with the overall amount of mass found in the point cloud within these areas, is statistically correlated with the amount of volume of timber out there. So by doing plots in strategic areas, we can expand to cover, we eventually want to do all of our state endowment lands, have this sort of information out. And so with some of our new projects we've done, we're doing these plots. You basically want to do the plots pretty close to when you fly the LiDAR, so that there's a strong correlation and the trees haven't grown a bunch or anything like that. But we're getting ready this summer to hire, I got to hire 4 field crew techs to go out and just spend a whole summer up in northern Idaho camping and doing these plots. And these plots are basically, you can do maybe 2 in a day. It's a lot of mapping. They're large, and you're just hiking around in the woods counting all these trees. So that's a shout out if anybody knows of anybody looking for a 5-month summer gig. We're looking for 4 people who want to go work in the woods to do some of this LiDAR stuff. So shoot me an email or something like that if there's any interest. And so our plan here, here's my mouse. This is, so we also have a pretty decent drone program now. The IDL has been able to utilize drones for a little while now, because they're really useful for fires. And another use we found is to do this FODAR mapping to also get a bunch of information for forestry using the drones as well. So we just have a fleet of drones. We don't have any LiDAR drones, but we have a fleet of drones with either NDVI cameras or RGB cameras. And so by stitching together gridded out photos, so in this picture here where we're using Pix4D is just a standard grid where the drone flies back and forth like a lawnmower and takes a million pictures. And then we'll stitch that all together to get these FODAR point clouds. So we're working now with the fact that we're getting so much LiDAR on our state ground that eventually, instead of reflying LiDAR because we already have all this information about the ground, we can fly FODAR and start to see how much these trees are growing. And that actually reminds me what I was going to say earlier when we're talking about the growth and yield of some of these trees is we're excited that we're finally getting reflights of LiDAR in areas that are about 15 years apart in some spots, where we can start to look at what we're predicting these trees should be growing compared to just seeing how much they actually grew by flying these flights out in the future. But the idea of using FODAR once you've flown LiDAR once, because you already have the base DEM information and you're just looking at how much these trees have grown. This is something we've talked with Washington DNR about. They've have a really organized program of doing this for a number of years now. And we've been testing this out from the drone side. There's potential to do this on a much larger scale using NAPE imagery and so forth, but it's with the quality of FODAR point clouds we get from our drone work, it's been pretty interesting at specific sites to look at incorporating LiDAR and FODAR data sets. When we first started looking at the FODAR route, we were hopeful, hey, we already got drone pilots and we can use this FODAR to make all our DEMs and so forth. But this is looking at a FODAR DEM in central Idaho, and you can see these doughy, cloudy areas. This is basically what happens if you don't have LiDAR underneath. You end up with this weird cookie dough sort of phenomenon where the computer doesn't know what's going on under those trees. The photos aren't ever really penetrating any of the canopy. So anywhere where it's thick trees, you just end up with no results. And it ends up being pretty useless if you don't have LiDAR first, because it's kind of a catch-22 for us, where if it's an area we want to go and do forestry practices or harvest work, it's got to be an area that has trees, which happens to also be the area we can't get any information out of the FODAR. So it's not as useful to have these really in-depth DEMs of areas that have already been clear-cut and so forth, or already been heavily harvested or in meadows and whatnot. We really need it where there's a lot of trees. So that was kind of a big limitation we found, which is where we've really pushed to acquire as much LiDAR at least once as we can to get LiDAR on all of our areas. And then talking about that canopy height model, this is just a look at one of our FODAR point clouds where it's just the raw point cloud colored by the RGB value from the picture. And you can tell just how detailed this FODAR information is. So it's really powerful. It's just not picking up anything underneath those trees, but we're excited to use a lot of this data moving forward to incorporate it with our LiDAR data. I like looking at these things. It's so much detail, it's crazy. So a couple years ago, started giving some in-agency LiDAR presentations and talking about the DEMs and so forth. And the agency decided that we wanted to go full on and get all of our endowment forest asset IDL land flown by 2020, which at first I thought was kind of silly because that just seemed like way too much too fast. But turns out we're actually on course, and a lot of that has to do with the GNA program, where the state is working with the Forest Service to help them manage their ground. Basically, what that GNA program has done, the Good Neighbor Authority, it's just made a really clean avenue for money flow for us. And the GNA program is very invested in getting a lot of LiDAR. And as many of you may know, LiDAR is all about buying as much as you can all at once. Once the plane's in the air, you might as well keep it flying. So I'm sure Nancy and her group knows better than anybody about how you get that going and try to get as many people involved. But we've been doing that a bit on our own because we basically get an easy way to get the Forest Service to jump in on some of these projects. And the Forest Service gets to flex their big muscles and fly these massive watersheds, while industrial timber companies and the IDL throw in our little bits of checkerboarded land and basically drive the cost up for them half the time. But it's been an interesting project trying to get all of our land flown where we don't have the resources to fill in neighboring landowners' land. We can afford what we own, and partnering with the Forest Service to make these pretty funky acquisitions where we say, here's some really big areas and here's some out of the way tiny areas. What are you going to charge us to fly the whole thing? and trying to figure out how you separate these out into different line items in the contract and so forth has been really interesting. So I'm doing one right now, which is over here on the right, which we're looking to fly a lot of central Idaho, and all of our, for the IDL, it's kind of called our timber basket, but it's a lot of our timber ground in the state of Idaho. And we originally started working with the Panhandle National Forest and the Nez Clear National Forest and Potlatch to kind of come together and make a big project area. And in the last month, it's kind of snowballed into everybody and their brothers jumping in on this thing. So it's become a really complex contract. We got a lot of people involved, but I can't see all the names on there because I got a Zoom meeting thing in front of it. But we got Idaho Fish and Game and Stimson and Bennett Lumber and the BLM and a lot of partners. IFG just joined us. Clearwater County's got a little piece in there. I think there's some others too. So this will be an exciting acquisition if we can get it out on the market here. This has been basically my whole world here, is setting these up. I think I'm done doing one of these for a couple of years because it's amazing how much time it takes to do all the iterations and drafts of changes of who wants what and so forth. And we're getting to the point with the amount of flights that FEMA's doing and everything that hopefully we can spend a year or two really focusing on our modeling and less on how to buy cheap LiDAR. But this is kind of how we've been going about buying it, is doing traditional airborne LiDARs that we put out as one big IDL contract, but we team up with as much neighboring people as we can to share the burden of the mobilization costs and the processing of the final deliverables and so forth. So this one on the left, we got most of that flown at 17 cents an acre from a company out of California. And we were pretty excited about that price. And it became a complicated project last year because the fires, the smoke coming out of Canada and North Idaho basically shut down the northern part of the state, or pretty much the whole country, it seemed like, for big portions of the end of the flight season. So we're still kind of getting all this tied together with what they were able to fly, but it's the data's coming in now and it's looking really good. So we're pretty excited about with how much work these are, just to at least how these end products end up. So I think that pretty much covers what we've got going on and what we've been doing, where we're headed. If you were to talk with, for people that aren't in the forestry world, I think if you were to talk with industrial timber companies and state agencies and so forth, we're right in the middle of where everybody's at. Is you know, what my job's been is just trying to, I think with LiDAR you get in the habit of saying, oh, in the future this is going to answer a lot of questions, and it's hard to not constantly just wait for the technology to improve and start making decisions and using the data now. And that's kind of what we've been doing, is trying to strategically pick the best uses of this data for what time and resources we have available and get as much data as we can. So there's my email if anybody wants it. And that concludes my talk.
Thank you, Jeff. Do you have time for questions from participants?
Yep, sure.
Okay. Let's see. Folks, there's a chat down at the bottom of your screen. I can either unmute everybody or somebody can type a chat with a question. But why don't we start with that, just to make it a little bit less cumbersome.
All right, let me pull up this chat, wherever it is. I wonder if my chat, here I'm gonna chat, there you go. Yeah. Okay, I think I got it here.
I can't see it at my end, but that's okay, as long as you can see the chat.
Yeah, it looks like it went private to me, so that works. Allison is asking, does LiDAR pick up the understory trees? So I'll start the understory tree question. It does. It just when you zoom around, I don't have one handy, but when you zoom down underneath the dominant canopy of a thick forest, you can see all the trees down in there, but it becomes really hard to see what's what. You're just seeing a mass of points and noise, and trying to separate that out has been an ongoing issue for us and a lot of people. So I think that one of the big limitations right now is just trying to figure out what you do with that information. You know, there's a bunch of trees down there, and the reality is all of it's just trying to predict to some accuracy what's out there, and it's never going to be perfect. A lot of times I feel like some of our forests, when you stand in them and you're looking around at these trees, if they're thick enough, you're going, I don't know if that's 2 trees or 1 tree, or it's really hard. The trees grow in crazy masses. So yeah, as far as pulling them out, it gets pretty difficult. But yeah, it picks them up. Your overall accumulation of points in areas that have a lot of understory trees will show up pretty thick. And one thing we do with our field plots is we have people also record just any woody mass vegetation that's there. So if there's a bunch of ocean spray or something like that, we make sure they record that in their tree list, because when we look at the point cloud, we don't know whether we're looking at a bunch of trees we're very interested in their growth patterns over 20 years, or if we're just looking at a bunch of understory brush in some scenarios. You just see a bunch of points. And I think where it's headed is hopefully this technology just gets denser and denser. And if it gets to the point where you can actually see the trunks of these trees and we can measure the DBH of these trees by looking at the point cloud, it'll drastically change the way a lot of people look at using LiDAR for forestry, because all of a sudden the field plot and the correlation with field data aspect becomes less and less important when you can see every detail right in the LiDAR point cloud. So that's that. Are you working with 3-dep? Are there any limitations working with 3-dep? I'm probably not that great at working with 3-dep. I'm pretty lost half the time as to what all happens on the 3-dep scale. We do our best to keep tabs on all that, and we look to work with 3-dep. And I think as we move forward, we'll continue to really want to work with 3-dep directly, especially if we look at areas we've already flown and we want new information so we compare our growth curves to what's actually reflown. But right now, a lot of my time is spent working outside of 3-dep, where we're just partnering with other agencies who want LiDAR now, and we just put it out on the market as quick as we can. And that's kind of our involvement. But we did pick up some ground in our Cottonwood block down in that big 3-dep Southeast Idaho project that Boise State was organizing. And we do try to jump in on different projects. And a lot of times I'm still getting the hang of what's going on the federal level and how it all works together, because our big flight up in the Panhandle, it now looks like that will be reflown, and we weren't privy to that. So it's all kind of trying to figure out how to work with everybody else. We're not the best at it, I don't think. Zach's asking if the LiDAR data will be available to public. Ours is not. So when we don't work in 3-dep, we don't plan on sharing our data. We have, we're mandated by law to be as profitable for the endowments as we can. And our philosophy currently is that if certain mills and different companies are analyzing LiDAR data that we've flown to have an advantage on making bids on timber sales, then that's not in our best interest. So we don't actively share data that we use in-house with everybody out there. But we're very welcome to working within the 3DEP realm moving forward, recognizing that LiDAR is in itself just becoming a public piece of information, and it's not something that will always stay private, but it's kind of been an ongoing thing. These projects we have going now, we've talked with industrial timber companies, and we all agree, we don't, even though we're all in the same contract, we're going to make the contractor send out ownership data separately and not let anybody have any control of anybody else's data, because everybody gets to be pretty stingy about not sharing that stuff. So the stuff we've flown on these private flights, as of right now, we're not going to share that data. If somebody's doing a university project or something like that, please get in touch with me and I'll ask the right people and see what we can do. But as far as just putting it out there for any companies that would bid on our timber sales, we're not doing that. Who in the BLM is involved in your LiDAR project? I'm curious, did you develop the applications to use an ArcGIS and LiDAR, or did someone else? The BLM is Jared Bowman, the forester. I don't know exactly where he's based out of. He's been my contact, and he called me this morning. He's got another guy who's going to take over, who's a GIS guy out of Craigmont or something like that. He's been our contact, and Jeff Lau from the Forest Service, from the Panhandle National Forest, kind of set up that contact and has been directly involved there too, because they've been sending, Robert Groh, I think his name is, been sending me updated BLM areas. So somehow they're all involved, and I just take the data and add it to the map. That's where I'm at on that. But yeah, email me directly if I can give you any contacts or anything like that. Did you develop the applications using ArcGIS and LiDAR, or did someone else? I made that ArcMap tool. I've been making those tools using, we've kind of been building, my bureau just purchased ArcGIS image server, which allows me to do raster analysis using a centralized server. So since we have so many area offices, I don't have to give everybody like a spatial analyst license and spend all the money involved with that. So I've kind of built those tools. The front end stuff is where I've done a lot more building the tools. The raster stuff behind it is not necessarily my forte. I'm involved in the decisions, and I understand a lot about some of the pixel-based multivariable regression type modeling, but we've got a new guy now that is has a lot of statistical background and does some really impressive modeling. And we've also contracted out with companies to do certain stuff, like where it comes to doing random forest analysis, to throw in a bunch of information and try to get that species and so forth. That's not the stuff I've been doing. So, but yeah, I built the ArcGIS tool, and yeah, we do as much of the in-house development stuff as we can. Jeff, do you create the tree objects? And if not, who did and with what software? Yeah, I've created a lot of the tree objects using R packages. Used to use Fusion. Now we're pretty much all using R, and I've pretty much phased out Fusion as anything we use in-house. I use FME, feature manipulation engine, and break down a lot of the point cloud and the segmentation and so forth there. Doing the reverse watershed type thing, where you just take your trees, your canopy height model, flip it upside down, start filling it with water. If there's a tree top, it should be its own little basin that gets picked as its own tree, and so forth, is how we've done the segmentation. So I do it in-house, or our other guy, Silas, does a lot of that now too, using Fusion, R, and FME. I hope someday soon you will be able to sell the data. Do those that help fund the LiDAR projects have access for a price? Yeah. if to sell the data, to sell the data somehow to get it on the LiDAR Consortium or something like that is something that if there's a path for that, it's possible that the people who make those decisions will be interested in that. Do those that help fund the LiDAR project have access for a price? So by help fund, so if you mean the partners that we work with, so like this last one we worked with, Hancock Forest Management and all these other industrial timber companies, they don't have access for a price. We're not, so far we haven't sold it to anybody, but what we are in talks with this next one here on the right, we're probably, once it's all said and done, look at working with Potlatch or some of these areas where if it's mutually beneficial to share our data because we are extremely intermixed in ownership, and it'd be a more in-depth stream network and road networks and so forth, we may do some swaps there. All of the federal data, it will be publicly available in this, which is large chunks of these acquisitions. So you won't pick up the bits of state and industrial timber unless they want to share them. But some of these massive watersheds here are all going to be sent to the Forest Service. And as far as I understand, they share everything. I'm not involved with that sharing process. I just know that Forest Service LiDAR is public data. And I assume on our new one, BLM will make theirs publicly available too, especially if people ask them directly and so forth. So I would pursue that. But the industrial timber and IDL, all those groups are pretty interested in not just sharing, or at least, yeah, there needs to be some reason to share just for our profit-driven interests.
Are there any other technical questions for Jeff?
Nothing's coming through on mine.
Okay.
That's good. I was mostly interested in federal. Okay. Yeah, that's not a question, just a comment. Yep.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Jeff, and thank you everybody for attending. I take it, since you shared your email address there, that you would be happy to answer questions if people emailed you.
Sure, yeah. Just, I can answer questions if I can help. I might redirect you if you can, but yeah, there Excellent. It is.
All right, well, thanks everybody. Thank you again, Jeff. We really appreciate it. And we'll send a recording out of this when we've got it completed.
All right, sounds good. Bye, everybody.
Goodbye, everybody.